Thank you everyone for joining us for today's IPAC webinar on Making a Difference, the application of a gender equity lens in public administration. Today we celebrate the winner of the J.E. Hodgetts Award for the best English article in the 2021 issue of Canadian Public Administration. My name is Everett Lindquist, and I serve as the editor of the journal and as professor of public administration at the University of Victoria. Today I'm hosting this event from the traditional territory of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with this land continue to this day. Now, the J.E. Hodgetts Award was created in 1992 by the Institute of Public Administration of Canada to honor the contributions of Professor Ted Hodgetts. Professor Hodgetts was awarded IPAC's Vanier Gold Medal in 1981 in recognition of his exceptional leadership and significant contribution to the field of public administration as a scholar, teacher, and advisor to governments. Later, he received the Order of Canada in 1989 for his lifetime of achievement and public service. Ted passed away in 2009. This year, the Hodgetts Award jury was comprised of three well-known public administration scholars: Luc Bernier from the University of Ottawa, Tamara Kurchenko from the University of Victoria, and Carrie Doberstein from the University of British Columbia, who chaired the jury and serves as associate editor for our journal, Canadian Public Administration, handling our innovative New Features feature and New Frontiers feature and book reviews. The committee reviewed all of the English articles in the 2021 volume of Canadian Public Administration, which is comprised of 4 issues, and meant to compare their respective rankings. So I want to take this opportunity to thank the jury for their important work. Now, as you know from the invitation, the jury selected an article written by Professor Maya Eichler of Mount St. Vincent University from the June 2021 issue of the journal, and it was entitled Administrative Tribunals and Equity, Military Sexual Assault Survivors at the Veterans Review and Appeal Board. The jury observed, and I quote, "This article is an exceptional example of creatively leveraging existing government data to clearly reveal a public administration problem. In this case, the apparent biased denial of disability benefits to military sexual assault survivors." And they went on to say, and also to show the concrete and powerful effects of policy change on public administration and justice. In this case, how the introduction of a gender equity lens and trauma-informed training among tribunal members corrects for bias. The jury went on to observe this is a timely topic with societal resonance and urgency, and is an important area of research in Canadian public administration with direct applications to administrative tribunals and review boards across various policy sectors. The article ought to be read by scholars and practitioners alike as a piece of research that speaks truth to power with actionable findings. This is high praise from 3 productive and very engaged scholars. To learn more about this work and its relevance, today we're going to hear from Professor Eichler herself and our discussant, Sayward Montague. Let me say a few brief words about each. Dr. Eichler holds the Canada Research Chair in Social Innovation and Community Engagement at Mount St. Vincent University, where she directs the Center for Social Innovation and Community Engagement in Military Affairs. She's an associate professor of political and Canadian studies and of women's studies. Maya, congratulations on your accomplishment. Sayward Montague is director of Advocacy National Association of Federal Retirees, which is Canada's largest nonprofit, representing more than 165,000 retirees from the federal public service and the veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces and RCMP. Sayward brings a unique perspective on Dr. Eichler's work. Thank you, Sayward, for being here today. So it is my pleasure now to give the floor to Maya, who will give a brief presentation, followed by observations from Sayward, and then we will take questions from the audience. You can put your questions in the chat, and there will be a couple of us monitoring those questions, and we will work them into our conversation. Over to you, Maya.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. Okay, does that look good to you? Yeah. Well, thank you, Professor Lindquist, first of all, for the introduction, and to IPAC for hosting this event today. It's truly an incredible honor to be receiving this award. I also want to thank the members of the jury for their work and service. And I want to do a special call out as well to Christy Paddock, the editorial manager of Canadian Public Administration, the Journal of the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, for all her attention to the article throughout the review and production process. Today, I'll be talking to you about making a difference, the application of a gender equity lens in public administration. I am joining you from Halifax, Chibuktuk, which is located on the ancestral unceded land of the Mi'kmaq people. I myself came to Mi'kmaqi as a settler in 2014 to take up my position at Mount St. Vincent University. By training, I'm a political scientist. I completed my PhD at York University in 2009. At Mount St. Vincent University, I lead a research center, the Center for Social Innovation and Community Engagement in Military Affairs, which is dedicated to military and veteran issues with a special focus on intersectional sex and gender-based analysis, as well as on equity, diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. And if you're interested to learn more about our work, you can check out the website, msvu.ca/CISIMA, or follow our work on Twitter as well. My research is really driven by a broad normative concern with issues around peace and social justice, and specifically in relation to our topic today, with a concern that public administration function in equitable ways. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about more today in terms of my article, which you can see here. Again, Administrative Tribunals and Equity, Military Sexual Assault Survivors at the Veterans Review and Appeal Board. This article is available open access on the website, thanks to a SSHRC Partnership Engage grant that allowed me to pay for that open access. As I say in my article, to ensure that administrative tribunals are effective tools of administrative justice, it is imperative that they function in equitable ways. And in order to do that, I argue we need to proactively apply an equity lens, such as a sex and gender-based analysis plus lens. It is not sufficient to treat all citizens or all users of public administration or of administrative tribunals specifically the same if our goal is to ensure equitable outcomes. An equity lens is needed to identify barriers and biases that may lead to discrimination against some users based on their unique circumstances or experiences. And as I show in the article, and I argue, an equity lens needs to become an explicit objective in the work of administrative tribunals and public administration more broadly, while at the same time, I do also believe that external scrutiny may be a necessary tool to ensure that equity is achieved. So in relation to my article, I want to talk to you about three things. How can we identify equity problems in public administration? How can we document them? And how can they be addressed? So I want to begin by telling you a little bit more about my motivation for undertaking this research. The motivation came directly from the impacted community, the military sexual trauma survivor community. And therefore, I want to begin by recognizing the important role played by Marie-Claude Gagnon, or as many of us call her, MC Gagnon. She is a retired leading seaman of the Canadian Armed Forces who became a leader in the military sexual trauma advocacy community. After the Deschamps report was released, which was the external review on sexual harassment and sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, which was released in 2015, she founded the peer support and advocacy group called It's Just 700. Marie-Claude's initial key goal was really only to act as a needed interim peer support program for those impacted by military sexual trauma until such a time as the federal government would step up to provide those services. Her closed Facebook page group grew and grew over time. At one point, it had over 700 members. And it became also, in addition to providing peer support, an important source to identify other areas of unmet needs of military sexual trauma survivors. It became a source for advocacy for policy changes at the Department of National Defense, Canadian Armed Forces, and Veterans Affairs Canada, as well as Wage Canada, in terms of seeking improved conditions, services, and care for survivors of military sexual trauma, both male and female. Marie-Claude Gagnon made the decision to step down from her advocacy role in 2021 amidst the military sexual misconduct crisis that year, which put a lot of pressure on the community of survivors. Marie-Claude and I started collaborating in 2017. She suggested examining Veterans Review and Appeal Board cases, as she had found anecdotally that members in the military sexual trauma community were more often facing negative decisions than others outside of that particular community. So she approached me and said, you know, it would be interesting to see if this is in fact true, like, can we document this problem? So she and I started off with this set of research questions. First of all, how successful are applicants or appellants who come to the Veterans Review and Appeal Board with a military sexual assault related claim for disability entitlement, and who come with a request to have their Veterans Affairs Canada decision in relation to that claim reviewed? So what is the success rate for those applicants or appellants? And if it is not very high, if they're not successful, we were curious to find out what were the reasons given for denying entitlement or an increase in entitlement in these particular cases related to military sexual assault. So the focus was really twofold. On the one hand, the Veterans Review and Appeal Board, which is a quasi-judicial tribunal that reviews Veterans Affairs Canada decisions on disability entitlement and assessment. So this board provides an opportunity for redress in the case of the denial or partial denial of a disability benefit made by Veterans Affairs Canada. So there's both a review hearing is one level of redress, and there's also an appeal level of redress. And so we were looking specifically at a particular subpopulation, that of military members or veterans approaching the board who had experienced a military sexual assault and were trying to make a claim for disability on the basis of that. So we know that prevalence rates of sexual assault are, of course, high in the civilian community as well, but they're particularly high in the military. There was a Stats Canada survey in 2016 that found that close to 1 in 3 female military members reported having experienced a sexual assault during service. That survey also showed that 4% of male military members had experienced a sexual assault during service. There's quite an extensive research literature on the impact of military sexual trauma, though it is primarily US-based research, I should say, but this literature shows us that, you know, the impact of military sexual assault is long-lasting and wide-ranging. It leads often to a premature release from the military, and it also impacts mental and physical health, leading to a whole host of potential conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders, reproductive and sexual health, urological, gastrointestinal, and cardiovascular conditions. So a lot of potential health consequences of military sexual assault. Now, how did we go about doing our research? So I want to talk just briefly about methodology. We relied on existing government data. We went to the Canadian Legal Information Institute's website that you can find on the slide here as well. So that website is, you know, CanLI is a nonprofit organization managed by the Federation of Law Societies of Canada. And its goal is really to make Canadian law accessible for free and on the internet. So we just used this, openly accessible database and searched for Veterans Review and Appeal Board cases, specifically in relation to sexual assault. And we also had to do an ATIP request to complement our search because there's just a bit of a time lag in terms of when some of those decisions are uploaded. So we did an ATIP request in addition to fill in some gaps we had in the data. So in terms of inclusion criteria, we looked at all Veterans Review and Appeal Board decisions from fiscal year 2009 to 10, all the way up to 2019 to 20. And we included all cases where an applicant or appellant was assault, either through the review board or appeal board. We ended up finding 122 cases for this time period, and we did both a quantitative and qualitative analysis using a software program called MaxQDA that supports coding for qualitative and mixed methods research. So what did we find? We did indeed find significantly lower favorability rates for survivors of military sexual assault who were approaching the Veterans Review and Appeal Board. So I have the numbers up here for you on the slide. While the average user of this administrative tribunal for the same time period would have seen a favorable outcome in 51% of review hearings, this was only the case in 29% of review hearings, specifically on military sexual assault related cases. At the appeal level, we see that the average user had a favorable outcome in 39% of cases, but this was the case only in 24% of cases for a military sexual assault related decision. So what are some of the reasons behind this? So when we read all of the decisions and looked at some of the arguments and justifications given, they really broke down into kind of three main sets of ideas. So the first one had to do with how board members understood and interpreted the credibility of evidence. And so this was both in relation to the credibility of the medical evidence presented in the claim, as well as the credibility of the applicant or appellant themselves in retelling their story. The second most common justification for denial had to do with how board members understood the causal relationship between military service and the disability, and whether that link was established in their opinion. The third set of arguments provided to deny a new entitlement or an increase in an entitlement had to do with how board members understood and interpreted the impact of cumulative trauma. So often there was a focus on pre-existing trauma, and that was used to justify the denial of an entitlement. Now, I want to also break this down a little bit for you in terms of sex. So applying a sex and gender-based analysis lens, of course, requires us to look at differences between male and female applicants and appellants. I don't have these numbers, unfortunately, for the average user, because the board was not collecting that data at that time. The way that I established it for these specific decisions in relation to military sexual assault is that I simply read each decision and looked at whether the applicant or appellant was referred to as he or she. So that's how I came up with these numbers. And, you know, very interestingly, what I found is that in the 11-year period that I reviewed, male survivors, in fact, faced even lower favorability rates than female survivors in the decisions of both the review board. As you can see here, 21% favorability for men who approached the board and 33% for women who were sexual assault survivors. And at the appeal level, it was 15% for men and 29% favorability outcomes for decisions related to women survivors. So what this tells me is that both groups face significant barriers, both male and female survivors of military sexual assault. But the barriers appear to be higher for men. And I think some more work needs to be done around why that's the case. But from the literature, we know that this perhaps might be the result of gender-specific reactions to sexual assault and gender-specific stigma around male sexual assault. So next, I want to talk to you about some of the more hopeful things, some of the change that I also found in this research, because what we found is that there was a shift beginning in late 2018 in the way in which the Veterans Review and Appeal Board handles cases related to military sexual assault. And of course, this happened in a broader context of growing awareness around military sexual misconduct in Canada, in the context of the Me Too movement, and most importantly, in the context of a class action lawsuit. So the Hader Beatty class action lawsuit was filed by 7 former military members against the Canadian Armed Forces for sexual assault, sexual harassment, and discrimination based on sex or gender or sexual orientation. The final settlement agreement was approved by federal court in November of 2019. And that final settlement agreement promised compensation for harm done, but it also led to very significant policy changes at Veterans Affairs Canada. And so what we see here at the Veterans Review and Appeal Board is how these policy changes that started happening even in anticipation of the final settlement agreement started to translate into practice at the Veterans Review and Appeal Board. As a result, the Veterans Review and Appeal Board introduced, for example, gender-based analysis plus training to its members. It introduced trauma-informed training as well to correct for bias, but it also developed new adjudicative guidelines in 2020, specifically in relation to cases related to military sexual trauma. And these guidelines provided instruction for board members on how to minimize harm in these kinds of board hearings by avoiding victim blaming and re-traumatization. I also want to mention the importance of Chris McNeil being appointed as the new chair of the Veterans Review and Appeal Board in July of 2018. He definitely took leadership on this issue and was keen to promote the changes. But as he has said to me himself, there was a lot of external pressure as well and advocacy that helped the board move in the right direction. But I think it's important to point out that kind of combination of leadership and external pressure, as well as the specific tools like GBA Plus and trauma training that were applied to make a difference, a real difference in outcomes for military sexual trauma survivors. So what are some of the implications of this research? The first thing I want to mention is that we don't really know yet what the implications are for male survivors. When I finished my research, which it ended at the end of 2020, so much, not the end of the fiscal year, so 2020, what I noticed is that improvements, the overall improvements that we were seeing had not yet occurred for male survivors. I didn't see a significant improvement in favorability rates for male survivors. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on and something that I may return to this research for to look at in more detail. I think this also highlights the importance of examining layers of inequity in administrative tribunal decisions as they pertain to historically marginalized subpopulations. And so I think it's important both to apply a sex and gender lens, as well as an intersectional lens, but also to look at marginalized populations or minority populations within historically marginalized subpopulations. So in this case, male survivors of military sexual assault. I think this research also shows that there's a continued need to proactively address equity problems, to make an effort to identify problems of equity in public administration and address them. I think the research also highlights the importance of applying a sex and gender-based analysis or gender-based analysis plus lens and a trauma-informed lens when we work with particular populations that are trauma impacted in particular. And so I think what I want to put out there to the audience today is maybe just to think about whether there might be similar equity problems in your area of work that you could identify. And, you know, is there a way for you to think about applying similar tools in your area of work that would help identify systemic biases, and how a gender equity lens or trauma-informed training might improve the equity of services and benefits in your area of work. So the bottom line is really that, you know, I think an equity lens, and especially a sex and gender equity lens, can make an important difference, and that we need to keep developing these tools and promoting their application in public administration. The other important insight for me is really that around community engaged research and user-centric research. You know, I think government can identify equity problems by asking those whose services, who use their services about their experiences, and that can help us identify a problem in equity. You know, if I hadn't had a member of the impacted community come to me with this idea for research, it is very unlikely that I would have ever come up with this research project on my own. So in many ways, I'm getting this award today because I listened to Marie-Claude Gagnon, who came to me with this idea and decided to pursue this research with her support. In closing, I also want to thank my students at Mount St. Vincent University, who over a couple of years were involved in supporting this research. Especially want to thank Ellie Lamoth, who helped with her research assistance. I also want to thank my postdoc, Lee Spanner, and the research manager of my center, Kim Smith-Evans. And I also have a little reference slide here. I'll just leave that up for a second in case anyone wants to take a screenshot and wants to dig a little deeper into any of these research areas. But for now, I will otherwise thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion with all of you, and especially with Sabert Montague. I'm happy she was able to join today as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Maya. It's just such an interesting research project, and it puts so many different issues about not only the societal issues and the trauma that was caused on the table, but also the how change happens in public administration organizations. So we can come back to that later. And so now I'd like to invite Sabert Montague to provide some of her own perspectives on this. Sabert?
Thanks very much, Professor Lindquist. And thanks for the opportunity to join today. And hi to everyone joining us. I am a settler joining you from Ottawa, the traditional and unceded land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And as mentioned, I'm the Director of Advocacy with the National Association of Federal Retirees. So we represent more than 165,000 members from coast to coast to coast, from the federal public service, as well as veterans of the armed forces and RCMP. I lead a team of 5, and our work ranges from government relations or lobbying, policy and position development, and member-driven engagement campaigns. I've connected with Maya since 2019, thanks to a colleague we have in common, or someone I'm privileged to call a colleague who's also a volunteer with our organization. You know, I just wanted to make some remarks, I think, about how important Maya's work is to organizations like mine that sits a little bit outside of public administration, but has something of an informal accountability or oversight role to play in representing affected individuals. And I think the main takeaway for me with this paper is there's really more involved in how policy is applied. We think of policy as something pretty cut and dried and The rules are the rules and you proceed with them, but how it impacts individuals, in this case, veterans, both during their experience with VRAB and the outcomes they then live with, and the study of it is so important. It helps me in my work understand where some of our constituents are significantly impacted and facing most barriers, and helps support that role that I mentioned about, external advocacy and some oversight and accountability. One of the things that struck me is the nuance. Maya notes that there have been barriers, and some of them might be surprising. It's easy or typical sometimes to encounter folks who conflate and say, VRAB is, denying claims on military sexual trauma cases, which are mostly women. Maya's research highlights the nuance that both men and women face significant barriers to favorable outcomes, but that the barriers faced by men in this case actually may be more significant or maybe higher, and due to the larger context of attitudes around gender and sexual assault. So that was really a stark reminder, I think, in terms of how we approach that issue specifically. The issue is really complex, but you can start to peel back the layers thanks to this kind of thought leadership. And it has the chance to be really transformative, not only in terms of how VRAB engages in what they do, but also for other bodies. And I'm interested in some of the other applications that this can have or start to have. Another aspect that was really interesting to me was the flow that was identified in how this started to occur. And that helps us pinpoint what we, as that body that sits outside of the public administration, but pops up to represent our members' interests and those of affected individuals, really helps us pinpoint what we should be agitating for when it comes to change or identifying where some of the issues happen. I mean, what struck me too was that Maya identified that VRAB replicated the norms and expectations by enforcing VAC's policy. So they were, not an instrument of that because they have that level of independence, but the policy was the kind of originating point of some of the issue. So that's why it's critical, I think, to get some of the policy and the thought right on this upstream. Otherwise, we're reproducing institutional bias and affecting individuals for years to come in terms of the outcomes that they have to live with. In the veterans context, this extends to the real upstream, so seeing change where service and service-related injuries occur, so with CAF and D&D, but it also speaks to the need for constantly improving and meaningful collaboration between CAF, D&D, and VAC. And I think it's also why it's important to have advocates, researchers, and external oversight working together too, because otherwise these issues would never, or would take a long time to be identified. And they're too important to not discuss and to not identify. So I just wanted to start off, Professor Lindquist, with that really about how Maya's research is important, and I think has a chance to transform how we approach and think about these bodies and the importance of getting policy right upstream and being really intentional with equity approaches.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much for that, Sayward. And now I would like to encourage members of the audience, if they have questions, to put them in the chat room, and we'll bring them to Maya. I've got a couple questions that I could start off with, of course. One of the things that your paper is about, I mean, although you're not drawing on the literature on organizational change and reform and so on, your case and your analysis speaks so much to it, I must say. It's just really very interesting to think about and explore. And so I was wondering, I'm quite struck by your observation and really account that by 2018, change begins to occur there. And in part, that's through leadership change. And this is not just change in the policies and directives given to the organization. It's also training and sort of levering, I think, new understandings that have been out there in the professional, academic, and society, communities out there about these issues that you're focused on. And so I'm just wondering if you could share more thoughts on that process of change. I mean, when I think of organizational change, I don't usually think of it having this much of an impact so quickly and in such a measurable way. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Mhm. Thank you, Everett, for that question. And I'll just throw in there that one of the other things I'm working on a lot these days is organizational change questions at the Department of National Defense and Canadian Armed Forces, because I also lead a collaborative network, an international collaborative network on transforming military cultures that is funded through a D&D Minds grant. And so, I think to me, that's kind of the bigger picture change. So, I looked at the Veterans Review and Appeal Board specifically, but really we're talking about a huge cultural shift that needs to occur within D&D CAF as well. So that's just one piece of, I guess, that bigger cultural shift. The other thing I will say here is that I think that change needs to keep occurring. So I think it's ongoing change we're talking about. It's collective ongoing learning we're talking about. Really, that's needed. So it's not really enough to say, okay, the RAB members, they got QB Plus training once, and now they'll have figured it all out. So I think for me, that's one of the challenges, how to think about this kind of training as ongoing, as evolving, as bi-directional, that we as outside researchers can maybe be involved in some of that, but we also learn from the challenges that people on the ground are experiencing in applying some of those lenses. Because some of the challenges have to do even with the collection of the correct kind of data. Like I go back to Seward's comment about nuance. There's still a lot of things we don't know about the experiences of members at the Veterans Review and Appeal Board. We don't know about the experiences of Indigenous members, military members and veterans who go to the board, or racialized members. So I feel like almost, I've only kind of scratched the surface there probably, but often that data is not collected. So I don't know how you as a researcher actually even do that analysis. I was able to do the sex-based analysis by looking for the he's and she's in the text. Some appellants and applicants decided to identify as they. So that, there's also that part there. But often other identity factors didn't clearly come out in the decision letters. So I think there's much more there to think about in terms of how do we set people up for success in terms of applying an intersectional sex and gender equity lens. Like, what kind of data do they need? What kind of training? And these are not things that can be done, once and for all, and we're done, and we sort of all know how to do it. But society is evolving. The Canadian Armed Forces is evolving. The culture is changing, and so what I documented, I feel, is like a small piece of that cultural shift that is occurring. But really, the Veterans Review and Appeal Board itself is kind of the tip of the iceberg. As Seward was saying, there's all these layers underneath, and we need to think about upstream harm prevention. But it sort of gives us a glimpse into the culture and how it can change.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I was quite intrigued in your article too. You had a few observations about the composition of the board and the groups that were there. And in your remarks, you didn't, obviously they're very succinct, you didn't talk too much about that. And you mentioned the kind of expertise that was drawn on for appointees to the board. What I was wondering is if the composition of the board had changed as well in terms of the mix of expertise, or perhaps gender balance, or if they were all from the military or veterans community or legal community, and if they, and how quickly did that happen?
Yeah, so I think that's also an ongoing process. So I know definitely that the chair of the board, when he came in 2018, was trying to diversify a little bit people's background. I mean, traditionally, the Veterans Review and Appeal Board has drawn on people who come from the military and veteran community, public safety sort of background, sometimes medical background, less so, but a little bit. It's been predominantly, male board members. So that's something that's changing, I think, relatively slowly, but it is changing. I had as well in my research looked at the influence of specific board members, whether I could find any sort of individual bias or whether the sex of the board member mattered. And I didn't really find that. It seemed to be that the biases and barriers came more from a shared understanding of the problem rather than individual bias. So I think that also needs to be part of the solution for sure, to even just draw on a greater set of expertise, have more diversity in background, more diversity in terms of identity factors, all of that I think is contributing to the culture change at the Veterans Review and Appeal Board, but it's not something that changes really quickly because board members serve for, I forget now, 2 or 3 years, and so there's a bit of a lag there for sure, and sometimes they serve for multiple terms as well.
Yeah, now I know new questions have emerged in the chat room, but fortunately, Maya, I have even more questions. So I was quite interested. So this idea of what precipitates change is really a powerful theme in your piece of work. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more. I see one question coming up here. I'll just ask mine and then we'll turn to the next question then. You pointed to the leadership of Chris, whose name I'm forgetting last name I'm forgetting right now. And I'm wondering where he came from. Did he come from, the defense and veterans community, or did he pop in from somewhere else? Had he already had experience with these kinds of change initiatives and working with GBA Plus and trauma-informed methodologies and sensibilities? Because in addition to the external change that you've talked about and pointed to, he seems to have been a real difference maker.
So I regret that Chris is not here today. He did want to come, but he is on the road and in hearings actually right now. And I don't know whether any of the other board members were able to join. I'm not sure, but anyways, Chris wanted to be here. And it's a bit awkward for me to talk on his behalf. I don't know all the details about his life, but I do know that he came from the Halifax Police Service and that he had a policing background, and he certainly had experience around victim rights, especially in relation to sexual assault cases. So he came with a bit of a sensibility already for these issues. But I think he also came with a really open mind to listen and to hear from the impacted community. He was, I know, willing to meet with the impacted community very early on when he first arrived in the job. So he came with that awareness and openness to learn. And my research evolved in conversation really with Marie-Claude Gagnon from Itch to 700 and Chris McNeil. So we had several meetings together. He came, to one of my presentations on this research when it was still quite preliminary. And he has always said to me that we need to learn from our history and the mistakes we've made in the past, and we need to, take that seriously and move forward. So I think it's also just the open mind and being willing to listen to the users who are coming to you and saying, the board is not working for us. So I think even, you don't necessarily need to have all the answers yet, I guess is what I'm saying. But if you have that willingness to hear from users and be open to feedback, and then realize that, you're not individually going to come up with all the solutions, but again, the solutions need to be developed collectively. And I think for the Veterans Review and Appeal Board, 2018 was just such a critical moment. The class action, the final settlement agreement was, almost fully negotiated. A lot of media attention since 2015 on this issue. People were starting to do research like me, so kind of like all eyes on some of these institutions and the this administrative tribunal in particular. So he said to me that he wanted to make change, but he probably couldn't have made it as easily without all of the external pressure and the advocacy. So I think you need both, probably, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and the theories of change, policy change, there's an approach called the multiple streams approach, and that talks about a confluence of attitudes, events, opportunities, critical events often that then allow for change to often occur quite quickly. We do have a pair of questions from Patricia Bishop, and she has asked, could you expand on the disproportionate treatment of male claimants in your study? And there's a second question that she's asked, how confident are you that real change will be sustained?
Thank you, Patricia, for those questions. So male MST survivors or male military sexual trauma survivors, I think we know quite little about their experience. There's been, they've been sort of the invisible group within the military sexual trauma community for the most part. But we know that there's a lot of them out there. So even if we just look statistically, what we know from the Stats Canada survey, as I mentioned, women in the military are disproportionately more likely to experience a sexual assault. But numerically, if 4% of men were found to have reported a sexual assault during service, and we know that so many more men are serving, right? It's like 16% women in the military and 84% men. The numbers are quite high. So I was actually surprised to see that only a third of the military sexual assault related claims that went to the Veterans Review and Appeal Board were from men. They should actually be higher if they sort of followed the numbers. So only a third of the claimants were men, or the applicants or appellants, I should say, were men. So that was the first interesting thing for me to see. And I remember talking to Marie-Claude Gagnon about this, and she had sort of theorized that a lot of male survivors might go and try to have their disability claim be based on something else, right? Because you might have combat deployments and sexual assaults, and you can sort of decide, in a sense, which one to emphasize when you go and make a claim for disability, for a disability entitlement. And so that was one theory, that men are less likely to reveal the sexual assault. That also may play a role in their condition. And the other thing is, I would say that, I guess what I'm saying is the hidden numbers are probably much larger. I don't think we're seeing kind of the full extent of affected male members coming to the Veterans Review and Appeal Board. And I don't know that I can say much more about the reasoning wasn't really that different, but there's clearly something going on here culturally in terms of how members of the board are thinking about a veteran, in terms of the hierarchy of trauma that we see in the veterans community, in terms of the privileging of, for example, combat-related post-traumatic stress over deployment-related post-traumatic stress over, on the lowest level, military sexual assault-related post-traumatic stress. So there's that kind of hierarchy that exists, that is a very gendered hierarchy. But then, for male survivors, I think that hierarchy at the bottom end, in terms of military sexual assault, is amplified. So it is even harder to kind of maybe recognize the military sexual trauma survivor, to believe that experience, to be able to recognize it and compensate for that. So I don't know. I think there's still a lot of questions out there. In the reference list, I have a link to a little piece on military sexual trauma survivors as well. And there is, of course, as one of our participants is saying, there isn't a lot of research. I mean, that there really isn't. And in my own research, I do a lot of research on military members and veterans as they transition from military to civilian life. I do a lot of qualitative research and interview-based research. And I have interviewed a few survivors, male survivors of military sexual trauma, but it has been extremely difficult to get male survivors to want to participate in research. So I think, it just tells me that I feel like this is a conversation we're going to still need to have in Canada over the next couple of years. What are the experiences of male military sexual trauma survivors, and how can they be supported?
Yeah, that's thank you for that answer, and that was a great question. Patricia had a second question, which is, how confident are you that real change will be sustained?
Well, I think real change will be sustained for this particular issue, but there's going to be other issues that creep up, and that I think the members of the Veterans Review and Appeal Board will have to receive training on. I mean, another sort of obvious one is women's sex-specific health issues related to military service. I mean, that's a conversation that maybe we're just beginning to have. We're really lagging behind in Canada in terms of women's sex-specific health research in relation to occupational and operational hazards of the military workplace. And so I think, there's some cases there probably coming up where education would be important for members of the board to be educated on female sex-specific health issues. And so I think, it's kind of amazing how much work it takes to make a little change like this. And it's kind of maybe depressing for me to say this, but I think, this is just like a little step on the long road ahead. So the learning that needs to happen cannot stop, right? The learning that needs to happen in public administration, in particular, sites like the Veterans Review and Appeal Board will have to continue in order to ensure equity in the long run. It's not done yet. So I think change for women, military sexual trauma survivors, that change has been accomplished. It's probably not perfect still, right? I mean, there's probably still some biases and barriers. I'm not saying that everything has been resolved, but I think there's lots of other issues that are coming up and that we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, one thing that I must say that you've emphasized in your remarks today is, and not as much in the article, is this idea of looking at the board as sort of a window back in to Veterans Affairs and national defense. And when you think about that, then it's, I suppose you could say it's a bellwether experience, and the hopeful answer that you've given about how change can occur is wonderful. But on the other hand, it's also daunting looking back to these larger hierarchies. I have one more question here, which is not as exciting as the last question, but what was it like this is from Suzanne Patterson. What was it like for you to review the transcripts of the decisions or the decisions themselves? And personally, I have no idea. Were they long? Were they short? Were they perfunctory? Were they difficult to interpret? Or were they kind of rich, a gold mine of information that might have raised one's eyebrows from time to time?
Yeah, I'd love to answer that question. But one thing I wanted to say in response to what you said before that, Everett, which was, we just have looked at this one, the tip of the iceberg here with the Veterans Review and Appeal Board. But the reason we looked at it is because there was data. And there was no data, and I still don't know how to access data, for example, VAC data on their decisions on military sexual trauma-related claims. So the reason that Marie-Claude and I did it is because we were like, well, there is this data, so let's look at this, and this will tell us something else about what's going on in the larger system. So it was kind of opportunistic as well in terms of this availability of data. Reading the transcripts was really, or the decision letters, I should say, that's what it is, the decision letters, was really difficult. So they are usually, they're several pages long. Some of them are longer. So some of them are like 10 pages, between 5 and 15 pages. There's variation, but there's certainly several pages long because the justification has to be laid out. And especially if if something's being denied, there's quite a lot of justification. They're the ones where entitlement is given, or an increase in entitlement is given are shorter. And in the paper, I have some excerpts as well. I just chose like one for each of the subsections. And there's some that are really hard to read because there's a lot of victim blaming going on in some of them. I mean, it's some of the older cases, but I wanted to document that. And I'm just kind of going through my article here because there was one that I wanted to maybe read out because it was so kind of disturbing because there was like multiple levels of victim blaming, but they also read very technically, I guess. That's the hard part about reading them as well, that they're sort of, it's a kind of quasi-legal technical document. And so it really removes the person from it, right? And so that's very hard, especially when you work a lot with that community. But I'll just give you an example from one of the quotes I have in the paper. And this is a case where the board is rejecting a claim because they don't believe the medical expertise. So they say the medical expert relates that the appellant's claimed condition is related solely to the sexual attack, which the appellant claims to have been a victim of. However, the board has a problem with the credibility of the appellant's story because it is not supported by any documentation or corroborated by witnesses, but mainly due to the fact that the appellant was severely intoxicated prior to the alleged attack taking place. So to me, that's an interesting quote because it entirely shows the lack of trauma-informed approach. So first of all, no consideration of why someone would not report, why there would be no witness, why intoxication is victim, why that pointing that out is victim blaming. So yes, they're very hard to read, actually. I mean, I guess that's all I'll say. Difficult to read because the person, you kind of miss as a researcher, you feel the pain of kind of not seeing the personal story there. And also just working a lot with the veterans community, a lot of veterans are very terrified when that envelope comes with their VAC decision or their veterans review and appeal board decision, because they're terrified of what the decision is, because it has real life, long-term, lasting impacts. Like there's people behind these decisions, right? And so I really wanted to, I guess that's why I did this research also, because there's real people impacted here, and making these changes can really change people's lives for the better.
Well, Maya, I think that's a sobering but appropriate note to end on. On the one hand, you've pointed to hope and change, and that we have the tools and the kind of leadership often to make things happen. As you and Sabert have also pointed out today, but also in your article, Maya, that having external pressure is important, and seizing opportunities to make change is important. And so I want to thank you again for your presentation, and also to congratulate you again for your article. There's so much good work in the journal, but this one stood out for the jury. And we're glad you could share your insights today. Let me say on behalf of our public administration research community, but also advocates who were on the call today, that we encourage you to revisit your research and perhaps work with others to find a way to spread these insights to the other tribunals and similar entities that are out there. So thank you very much. Thank you to Sabert for starting us off in the question and answer period. I want to thank all the participants today for having taken part in this webinar. This webinar will be recorded and then made available later, and you'll get notice of that. So if others, such as Chris, could not make it, then he can see again what you've had to say. Finally, what I would like to do is thank Erin Bellwood, who is the events manager for the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, and also the CEO, David Fulford, for their support of the webinar today, but also for the Journal of Canadian Public Administration. So thank you everyone for our participating today. And we look forward to seeing you at the next IPAC webinar. Goodbye.